Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced, and you are listening to, well, one of my many podcasts on data or web development. And the purpose of this episode is to talk about something that's going to be relevant to all of you, whether you're in the web development space or just the development space in general, or in the data analytics and data engineering space. And this is the context. This is what's called the MCP, or Model Context Protocol. This is a open standard, and for those of you who followed my work with like Iceberg and Arrow, just advocating for these things, I'm big on open standards, because open standards make it where our software can work together better, allowing us to kind of build the systems that we need. Okay, so in the sense whether it's the Apache Arrow standard for in-memory data, or the Apache Iceberg standard for how we represent metadata around data sets, or we're talking about the REST REST standard or HTTP standard in how we send messages regarding content over TCP/IP, all these kinds of great things. The MCP standards kind of is the standard for the AI era. And to kind of understand sort of why MCP is important, we need to understand sort of what came before MCP. So if we think about what's been going on the last several years, the big thing has been LLMs, large language models. So these are models that basically what they do is that they are trained on lots of text and the meaning of that text. And this gives us the ability to provide sort of text prompts, which could be in the form of questions or, basically a chat, and it responds via text. And essentially the underlying thing that's going on is, all this data is trained into what's called a vector, which is a series of numbers, because at the end of the day, computers only understand numbers. And these numbers kind of create a multi-dimensional space in which all these sort of bits of information are located. And essentially, if you imagine, like we live in a three-dimensional space, so there's three dimensions, X, Y, and Z. I can see sort of which items are physically closer to each other because I can visually see, okay, hey, this thing is close to that thing. Now imagine a space that has like thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dimensions. Okay, and then being able to kind of see what things are relatively close to each other in that space. That's essentially how vector databases work, and these types of machine learning kind of works. So essentially you turn data into numbers, okay, which is an X number of features, aka dimensions. You train data based on those dimensions, plotting these sort of points in this dimensional space. And then what you can do is you can use that dimensional space to kind of notice, hey, what things are closer together, to kind of notice trends and patterns that allow the algorithm to kind of give you a response. Okay, so that's sort of how that kind of mechanically works on the hood. There's a lot more to it, but that gives you enough to kind of understand what's going on. So you have these LLMs, if you ever use like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, or Grok, to send prompts to or text to and receive a text answer. These become really popular, but generally by themselves, all they do is they give you text responses. So they're good at saying, hey, I have this thing, give me a response about this thing. And this is great for like doing research or helping, do like grammar correction. So I sit there and like, submit some text that I wrote and say, hey, can you rewrite this for clarity in grammar? These things are great. It can give you advice. Of course, you should always take it with a grain of salt. All sorts of really useful things that you can get back as text. But at the end of the day, it can only do what it can give you back as text. It cannot take like actions, like it cannot take control of like software systems and whatnot. So how would you take it to that next level? So this is where the concept of like an AI agent comes in. So the idea is that what you do is you create some sort of binding that will prompt the LLM with your prompt. So, hey, I'm asking X question or giving X direction. But then these frameworks, things like LangChain, for building these AI agents would also generally not just provide your prompt, but provide all this other context in the form of what's called a tool. Okay, and a tool is essentially a function. So you would have some sort of server that has a function designed that can be called. So now the LLM would get a list. Hey, these are the tools you have available. These are the descriptions you have of those tools. This is the question you have. What should I do to accomplish this? And now the LM, given that prompt, can then respond with directions saying, hey, you know what? If you're trying to do that, you should probably use this tool first. Okay, using this information as a next step. And now the AI agent can then parse that answer and say, okay, hey, let me go call this function in my software and then come back and give the response and ask the LLM for the next step. So the LLM becomes sort of like a manager, like basically you're saying, hey, you have these tools, how would you use them? And then as the LLM is kind of describing back to the agent how it would use them, the agent then actually uses the tools. Okay, so now what can happen is I can create tools that like, create a new user account or send an email, do actual things in the real world that don't require sort of human intervention. But the problem is, like, while frameworks like LangChain are agnostic to the LLM, when I design my particular, let's say, tool, I have to kind of choose what LLM I'm using at the time in my code. And two, I have to design an interface because it's not standard. Like LangChain allows me to create an agent, but how you interface with the agent I create, it could be a CLI. I've done it using like actually creating a little like web interface with a chat. Like you can decide what your interface is going to be. But there's no standard way that the interface talks to the server. It's up to how you wrote your code. So that means there's a really strong coupling with the logic, the tools, the memory, like the actual way the agent works, the guts of the agent to the interface of the agent. Which means, there might be an agent that does what I want it to do, but I got to use this particular interface. And, it just becomes not a little bit more cumbersome than it needs to. So wouldn't it be nice if you could just use one interface and interface with a growing ecosystem of sort of these tools and actions and resources that this agentic sort of world can provide? And this is where MCP comes in. MCP is a standard created by Anthropic. Anthropic are the people behind the Claude LLM. Okay, and although everyone's kind of getting behind this standard because it makes a lot of sense. And the idea behind the MCP standard is that you would point your interface, which is typically another LLM. So right now, the main one you would use is Claude Desktop, not Claude on the web. You'd have to use Claude Desktop. What you would do is you would say, hey, Claude, there's an agent software where there's a MCP server located in this place on my computer. This is the command to run it. And so you're aware of it. Okay. And the idea is that MCP server knows there's like a standard protocol by which it communicates with. So it has sort of standard RCP commands. And for those who don't know what RCP means, it stands for remote call procedures. So it just means you can remotely call a function. So it's not like an HTTP standard where I'm going to use like URLs. So I'm like, hey, call X URL to get certain resource from remote server. In this case, you're using terms like resource / whatever. Like you would pass like this term and that triggers a function. And this is all done through JSON. So like a JSON payload is sent to the MCP server that kind of has these directions. Like, hey, this is the thing I'm asking you to do. And here's the arguments to that thing I'm asking you to do. Again, most of that stuff kind of works under the hood. You don't really need to know how like specifically that works. If you use the SDKs, the software development kits for MCP, it'll just kind of abstract that away. You just worry about like, hey, what do I want it to do? Okay, so that's the deal there. So essentially with like an MCP server, the benefit is like you can create all the logic of what you want someone to be able to do with their client, but it's completely separate from the client. So I can design my tool saying, hey, like here's like a get email address tool. Here's like a send email tool. And that way it can just do that. Okay. And then as far as like the client goes, any client that knows how to talk to an MCP server can now interact with that server. So I could have, let's say, again, a server that is for like sending out emails to my clients. And I could use Claude Desktop to interface with that MCP server, but I could use some other custom interface or OpenAI in the future when it supports MCP. And now different things that I have can now all leverage those tools. So in case, maybe I prefer using Claude Desktop to go say, hey, look up the list of my clients and send them this email, okay, or so forth. And the cool thing is in that Claude or whatever the client would be, again, when it connects to the server, is going to get a list of not just tools, because like MCP allows you to break everything up in sort of like different categories. So you have tools, but tools are going to generally be more clearly things that you do. Okay, so like send an email. Okay, now in this case, when it comes to getting information, you can put that under the category of resources. So you request and you get back information. So information and this also could be like metadata around information that you have. So I can do things through tools, again, send email, whatever, run a query. Then two, get just sort of static information to be resources. Then there's also prompts. So the idea here is like for certain tasks, I can create template prompts that I can leverage. So I can sit there and say, hey, here's a template prompt for, getting and sending emails. So in this case, I can create, I send it some instructions that are not necessarily full, but it'll identify that, hey, within this MCP server, there's actually a prompt for helping me accomplish X task. I can use this prompt, fill in the variables, and then actually better accomplish this task for you. Okay, because again, what happens is when you have agentic AI, what it's doing is not just taking your prompt, it's taking your prompt and a listing of all the resources of the agent, the tools, the resources, the prompts, and the descriptions of those things, and providing it to the LLM and asking, hey, given all these tools that you have and this question, how would you do it? And then taking that response and actually taking action based on those responses. MCP just creates a standard way to express it, because now the MCP server, like once that tool like Claude Desktop realizes it, it understands what are sort of like the JSON messages it should send in return and expressing what the next action should be. So it's no longer just, hey, like giving you, you're not hoping that the response, will work. Again, it's like, you're not shooting in the dark as much. You have a much more sort of formally designed way, so that way the conversation between the tool that you're interfacing with and the server with all those tools and resources and prompts is going to be much more smooth and accurate, because there's a standard way that they express things to each other that they both understand. So overall, again, it opens up all your favorite clients to an ecosystem of tools or an ecosystem of servers that you can use to enhance the kind of things you can do. Okay. But at the same time, again, it creates that standard, so that way when you do connect to these things, you're going to get a much better experience than you do today using a lot of these sort of more ad hoc AI frameworks that, the underlying LLM doesn't necessarily understand. So, there's other machinations that kind of have to happen under the hood to make it work. In this case, you have a standard that everyone understands, and it can all work much more smoothly. So that's what's exciting. So right now, if you're like basically imagine the applications of the future, essentially every software is going to want to have an MCP server to give the ability for AI tools to be able to actually use the software. Whether, you're thinking of, like, again, sending emails, posting on social media, you're going to want some sort of MCP server template that someone can then customize for their own, credentials that they can then, run on their, basically have interact with their, like a lot of times the MPC server you'd probably download and then have it locally located with your desktop client, at least currently right now with the way Claude Desktop works. So in this case, you want to create these tools that people can then download, put it in the whatever, directory that they're going to have their MCP server on. And now maybe I could, post to Facebook using, text prompts, or, orchestrate marketing pipelines and say, hey, here's a message, post to Facebook, send these emails to these particular clients, and do that all in the matter of a prompt. Okay, that's sort of like the potential of this. So now, like everyone and their mother, if you're on the software developer side, you're creating these MCP servers. If you're on the data engineering side, you may want to still create these servers to help manage your pipelines and sit there and say, hey, think of all the different steps of your pipelines. Instead of using something like Airflow to orchestrate all your different pipelines, imagine that you could have an MCP server that's aware of all the different sort of tasks that you need to do, and you can actually just sit there and describe the end result and sort of the order you do things. So essentially, DAG through prompt, and then you essentially get the same result as like an Airflow DAG, but you're doing it through a prompt, because the agent will just, do everything as you described it. Because the MCP server itself has all the primitives for it to take the actions that you would want it to take in your sort of your pipelines, okay, and interface with your tooling. Or, and again, in the data analytics side, it could be something like, preparing, things within your tooling for generating reports or BI dashboards, so that way you can literally just sit there and with a prompt generate a DI dashboard within the accounts you have, outputting to the tooling that you use. Okay, so there's a reason why everyone should kind of like learn how to build MCP servers and also learn how to work with MCP servers, because again, once you built these MCP servers, you can now automate a lot of the tasks that you might do wherever, through a text sort of interface, a text prompt interface. And this makes sort of now LLMs and LLM interfaces the interface to the entire web, okay, the entire world of software. Okay, where basically in the past, once pretty much every API is abstracted into an MCP server, I could just connect the appropriate MCP servers to my LLM and interact with the world of APIs and tools that I would normally do through a lot of custom software, and literally do it all with sort of a text language, which really opens up the world of being able to do things to a whole new sort of class of, makes prompt engineering like an actual thing, in a sense. Like, I mean, it's a thing, but I mean, in the sense where like you can actually engineer via prompts in a sense. So it's pretty exciting. I'm going to be doing a lot about this. I'm coming out with a lot of content around this. So if you're not following me on Medium or Substack or whatnot, make sure to look that up. You just head over to alexmerced.com. You should be able to find everything that I do, or follow me on LinkedIn. You won't you won't miss a thing if you do. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this, regardless of which podcast you are listening to. And if you guys enjoyed this, make sure to tell other people about my podcast, and make sure to follow me on LinkedIn and all that good stuff. And otherwise, I'll see you all later, and have a great day.